Old Henry is one of the best Western films to release in years, and a big part of the reason why is its twist ending, which you'll either find super obvious or totally confusing, depending on how well versed you are in American history. So today, let's get to the bottom of who Henry McCarty really was, by looking over all the clues in the film that you might have missed, while exploring how much of the plot is actually based on real-life events. So in the case of Old Henry, I think the best way to break down the movie is by revealing the big twist first and working backwards. So spoiler alert, but Henry McCarty in Old Henry is actually the famous gunslinging outlaw Billy the Kid, somehow alive and in hiding many years after he was supposedly killed by the lawman Pat Garrett. Now, to fully understand how this is possible, we have to go back to the start of the film, where we get a huge clue straight off the bat, when in a voiceover Henry says,
"It can be hard to tell who and what a man is. He's got a mind to convince you otherwise."
Now this proves to be a really telling bit of foreshadowing, given that practically every character in the movie is pretending to be someone they're not, including Henry. Yet despite this, in the initial voiceover, Henry is quite open about his history, mentioning that he was born in New York before spending time in Kansas, Arizona, and Mexico, which matches up perfectly with the early whereabouts of the real-life Billy the Kid. Henry also mentions that he's tried his hand at many vocations, which is likely a reference to how Billy the Kid started out as a regulator before later becoming an outlaw. Alongside this, he references that he was briefly a husband, as we see a grave marked Marie Hobbs McCarty. Now for many, this would have been the first big giveaway of the twist, as the real legal name of Billy the Kid was Henry McCarty. But what's interesting is that historically speaking, he was never known to have had a wife, and judging by her age and year of death, Henry would have had to have married Marie after he was supposedly shot and killed as Billy the Kid by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. But Henry then goes on to definitively state that despite his past, he is now a farmer, living a peaceful life with his teenage son Wyatt in 1906 Oklahoma Territory. And when his son happens to ask why Henry decided to settle there in the first place, he replies,
"If you'd stake a claim, hang on to it for a year, it was yours. Seemed like a pretty good deal at the time."
So if we were to believe that Billy the Kid did somehow survive, it makes a lot of sense that he would choose to start a new life somewhere isolated and uninhabited, where he's very unlikely to be recognized or draw attention. And it would seem that this was the case for many years, or at least long enough for Henry to raise his son. But when a horse with blood on its saddle suddenly shows up on his land, Henry immediately heads out to search for its rider. In doing so, he eventually finds an unconscious man called Curry, bleeding out from a bullet wound. So he quickly gets to work on treating it, clearly having learnt to do so at some point in his past. Henry then finds a gun and a satchel full of cash, to which he simply says,
"Nope."
Clearly recognizing that getting involved could threaten the peace that he's worked so hard to build, Henry decides to ride away, but ultimately can't help but go back for the money, as if doing so were in his very nature. Following this, Henry returns home with Curry and tends to his bullet wound. And as he works, Wyatt poses the theory that the stranger could be an outlaw, and notes that the scars on his body are very similar to the ones he's seen on his father. But Henry brushes him off and goes outside to collect the money, before staring off into the distance, clearly concerned that someone might come looking for it. With this in mind, Henry hides the gun and cash, while Wyatt spies on him under the door. So when Henry heads out to fetch a doctor the next day, his curious son sneaks into his room and steals the gun to practice shooting, causing Curry to have flashbacks from his childhood of when he happened to meet Billy the Kid, who tells him to keep his head down before entering a house and getting shot. Now it turns out that this scene was Curry actually remembering the night that Billy the Kid was killed, as it lines up exactly with how the real Billy entered the darkened bedroom of his friend Pete Maxwell while whispering who was inside in Spanish, only to be ambushed by Pat Garrett, who killed him with a bullet to the chest. Meanwhile, Wyatt returns the gun to its hiding place, but decides to snoop around in his father's belongings, discovering a firearm and newspaper clippings alluding to the infamous gunslinger John Wesley Hardin, as well as the Lincoln County War, with the headline "Garrett Gets His Man," obviously referring to the death of Billy the Kid. So if Henry were Billy, it would make a lot of sense for him to sentimentally hold on to his old gun and newspapers that referenced his exploits back in the day. Following this, Wyatt is attacked by Curry, forcing Henry to step in and save him, instinctively beating Curry unconscious before going for a shotgun to finish him off. But instead of killing him, Henry tortures Curry for answers that aren't forthcoming, until a trio of bank robbers disguised as lawmen arrive on the farm searching for Curry, who they claim is a dangerous killer wanted in Missouri and Tennessee. Despite this, Henry knows better and plays dumb, while remaining oddly calm throughout the standoff, prompting the leader Ketchum to say,
"Your last name McCarty?
That's right.
First name?"
Henry.
With this confirmation, Ketchum suggests Henry might be related to Billy the Kid, clearly unable to believe that the unassuming farmer could be the same man. But after Henry sends Ketchum on his way, he remarks that Henry seemed oddly proficient with a gun for a peaceful farmer, and hatches a plan to attack his homestead. Meanwhile, later that night, Curry asks if he and Henry have ever met, before sharing that as a child he worked for a rancher called Peter Maxwell, a friend of Billy the Kid, who in real life is suspected to have tipped off Pat Garrett to the whereabouts of the outlaw the night he was shot, which Curry witnessed. And from his point of view, Billy the Kid really did die, because he explains that although Pat Garrett missed his first shot, the second hit his chest, and afterwards he saw the body of the outlaw taken out under a bloody sheet. Now this recollection of events really explains a lot, as it shines a light on why Curry feels he knows Henry, because they have already met, but he doesn't clock that Henry is Billy because he's now a lot older, and Curry truly believes Billy is dead, so he knows that Henry can't possibly be him, even if he does have suspicions. It also explains to some degree how Billy survived that night in Fort Sumner in the film, as his body was apparently carted out under a sheet, meaning that he could have still been alive, or it might not have even been his body. And as for the bullet he took to the chest, it would seem that given that Henry is alive, it didn't prove fatal, but did leave a scar that Wyatt was reminded of when they were treating the gunshot wound on Curry's chest. Also, during this conversation, Billy reveals that his dad died when he was young, and made him an orphan in his teens, which again lines up with the childhood history of the real Billy the Kid. So after sharing a meal together and realizing how much they have in common, Curry eventually gains Henry's trust, convincing him that he really is a lawman, despite him also secretly being an outlaw. And just as Curry gets hold of a gun and sees an opportunity to kill Henry, Curry is knocked out in an attack on the house, forcing Henry to outsmart his attacker and kill him with his bare hands in front of his son, demonstrating that he is actually a violent man at his core. This leads Wyatt to directly question his father about who he is, prompting Henry to admit that he regrets what he did in his youth, likely referring to his time as an outlaw, but stops short of clarifying as much. And before he can, the next day, Ketchum returns with a posse, holding Henry's brother-in-law to ransom, forcing Henry to once again arm up and confront him, while deflecting questions about his true identity, as it becomes obvious to everyone that he's not really a farmer. Following this, Henry refuses to back down, before Ketchum kills his brother-in-law and goes on the offensive, knowing that he has Henry outgunned. But back inside, Henry says to his son,
Now keep your damn head down. You'll be all right.
And with this, Curry instantly recalls that Billy the Kid said the same exact thing to him as a child, leading him to piece together that Pat Garrett must have helped Billy fake his death that night, because when Henry straps on his holster and puts on his hat, there's no doubt left in his mind that Henry is Billy the Kid. Ketchum and his gang then learn this the hard way, as Henry dispatches them all with ease, just how you would imagine a legendary gunslinger would. And when he returns home, Curry makes clear that he now knows who Henry really is, just as Henry realizes that Curry too has been lying about his identity, discovering that he is in fact an outlaw after all. So Curry shoots Henry, forcing Wyatt to step in and save his father, just in time for him to come clean to his son and say goodbye. Henry also mentions that he doesn't believe in redemption, but in reality, Old Henry is a redemption tale, given that it resurrects one of the most infamous outlaws of all time in order to give him a chance of redeeming his legacy through the act of fatherhood. Wyatt then buries his father and rides out alone into the world as an orphan, just like Henry did, leaving us to wonder if Wyatt will end up just like his dad, feeding into the overall theme of the movie about about identity, in that it's not names, titles, or legacies that define who we are, but rather the actions and choices that we make moving forward. Now, as for how close Old Henry was to real-life events, obviously the big deviation from history is that Billy the Kid survived being shot by Pat Garrett during their encounter in Fort Sumner. But accounts do vary on what exactly happened that night, given that there were very few witnesses. Not to mention the fact that the corpse was burned the very next day, after a coroner's jury certified that it was Billy the Kid. So although Old Henry is obviously fictional, the idea that Billy the Kid did somehow survive and go on to live a life in hiding does hold some weight, especially after a man called Brushy Bill Roberts came forward in the 1940s with a somewhat convincing but flawed claim that he was the famous outlaw. And although the historical consensus is that Roberts was just an imposter seeking fame, due to the lack of clarity and evidence around the night of Billy the Kid's shooting, it's left plenty of room for alternative theories about how he might have survived, further popularized in pop culture by the plot of Young Guns 2. However, Old Henry takes this concept much further, melding fiction with fact so convincingly and in such a grounded manner that it's really easy to believe that Henry McCarty could have lived to see another day. But let me know below, what did you think of the film? And do you believe in the idea that Billy the Kid might have actually survived that night in Fort Sumner? Also, while you're here, you might want to check out this video covering the upcoming Young Guns 3.